It started with a drip, faint at first, like the whisper of rain on old wood, except it hadn't rained in weeks, not in the town of Alder Creek, where skies stayed dry and brittle in early September, and no storm had passed through in days, yet the sound echoed from the attic of the old Crowley house, newly bought, newly opened, after sitting dormant and unloved for over 2 decades, and for Holly and Marcus Levington. The house was supposed to be a fresh start, a quiet retreat from the noise of Boston, a place to heal after the year they'd both rather forget, but that night, as Holly stood beneath the attic door and tilted her head up, something landed on her cheek, not water, not sap, but something thicker, darker, sticky, and when she wiped it with her finger and held it to the light, the smear that stared back was black as ink, thick as oil, and she froze, breath held, as the drip came again, and again, steady now. Like a metronome, like something alive was pulsing above, so she called for Marcus, and together they climbed the creaking wooden steps to the attic, flashlight in hand, expecting raccoons, or maybe a busted pipe, but what they found instead were floorboards warped and cracked with age, a trunk in the far corner covered in a stained white sheet, and the source of the dripping, a patch of ceiling that looked like it had been scorched, the wood above it charred and glistening, but not from fire, no, from something else. Something that smelled faintly of ink and rust and paper left too long in the rain, and Marcus reached up to touch it, only to recoil with a sharp gasp, saying it stung, like acid, like it knew he was there, so they backed away, uneasy, deciding to call a local inspector in the morning, but as they turned to leave, Holly noticed something else, carved into the floor just beneath the trunk, a set of initials, etched with a shaking hand, LC plus MC, dated 1996. The year the Crowley children disappeared, and suddenly the air felt heavier, colder, as if the attic remembered something it wasn't ready to forget, and that night neither of them slept. The drip continued, a slow relentless beat above their heads, like something was waiting to be remembered. The next morning Holly went to the town hall, curious more than anything, and asked about the Crowley family, and a clerk, an older woman with kind eyes and a tight mouth, leaned in and lowered her voice, whispering, "That house never should have sold, you know, not after what happened, those kids, they were just gone." And when Holly asked for more, the woman hesitated, then slid her a faded newspaper clipping from an old archive binder. The headline read, "Brother and Sister Missing, Last Seen Playing in the Attic of Family Home," and a photo beneath showed 2 children, Lucas and Maribel Crowley, ages 10 and 8, smiling on a porch that looked all too familiar, and suddenly the initials made sense. The date burned itself into Holly's mind, and that night she returned to the attic alone, drawn to the drip that hadn't stopped, and when she pulled away the old sheet from the trunk, what lay beneath made her breath catch, a collection of children's letters, bundled in twine, the topmost envelope sealed with wax and addressed, in a child's hand, "To whoever finds this," and as she opened it, the scent of old ink filled the air, and the paper inside was tremblingly written. The first line said, "If you're reading this, we didn't make it out," and Holly sank to the floor, heart pounding, because the rest of the letter described a door, not a door in the house, but one that sometimes appeared in the attic wall when the moon was right, a door that led to somewhere else, somewhere they had been tricked into entering, and it ended with one last sentence, "It takes what it needs and erases the rest," followed by a drawing of 2 stick figures holding hands beneath a black archway. And Holly couldn't look away. She brought the letters down to Marcus, who read them in silence, then said nothing for a long time, and finally asked, "Do you think this is real?" But Holly didn't answer. She was still watching the ink on her fingers, the black stain that hadn't left since she'd touched the ceiling, and later that night, when she passed the attic door again, something had changed. The dripping had stopped, but now, faintly, ever so faintly, she could hear what sounded like 2 children laughing, just beyond the ceiling. And if you're still listening now, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more twisted mysteries and stories that blur the line between memory and myth, because this one is only just beginning. The next morning, Holly woke to find the attic door slightly ajar, not open wide, just cracked, enough to suggest something had passed through, or wanted her to, and though the logical part of her insisted it was just a draft, just a misaligned latch, something in her stomach coiled tight with dread, because they hadn't touched that door since the night before, hadn't gone up again, and the letters, the ones she'd found in the trunk, were now lying in a neat row across the kitchen table, even though she was sure she'd tucked them away in a drawer, and one of them, Maribel's last note, was open again, its ink smudged as if read by someone with wet fingers, or not quite human skin, and she turned to Marcus, who stood frozen at the sink, his gaze fixed on the kitchen window where the backyard swayed gently in the breeze, and he said, without turning, "I heard them again last night, laughing, they were right above us." And Holly didn't answer, just walked slowly back to the attic, drawn by something heavy and invisible, like a thread was tugging at her spine, and when she climbed those stairs again, the light above her flickered twice, and then steadied, as if giving her permission, or daring her to come closer. The ceiling stain had spread, black veins now curling down the walls like branches searching for roots, and near the spot where the trunk had sat, a seam had appeared in the wall, not a crack, not damage, but a seam, like a hidden door frame masked by old wallpaper, and Holly stepped forward, pressed her palm against it, and the wall felt warm, pulsing faintly, like it was breathing, and behind her, something creaked, not a floorboard this time, but the air itself, like the house had inhaled and wasn't sure how long to hold its breath. Then Marcus called her name from below, his voice sharp, afraid, and she turned and ran down, finding him standing over their living room rug, where ink, thick and black, was seeping up from between the boards, spelling something out, not clearly, not fast, just a letter at a time, curling and stretching until they could read it. "Help US," and neither of them spoke, just stared as the ink dissolved back into the floor like it had never been there, and Holly said, almost too quietly, "They're still in there," but Marcus shook his head, "No, they're gone, it's the house now, the house remembers," and they both sat in silence for a long time, until Holly opened another letter, this one addressed to Mom and Dad, even though the Crowley parents were long gone. The note spoke of the room that only appeared when the light hit. Right, and how once you crossed the threshold, you didn't walk, you floated, and how time got fuzzy, like everything was out of order, and how Maribel had seen another version of herself trapped behind glass, crying but silent, and how Lucas had started forgetting their names, and then himself, and then one day he said, "We're part of the ink now, it's how it eats, how it remembers." And Holly read that line twice before folding the letter shut and realizing her fingertips were stained black again. Even though she hadn't touched the ceiling, and that night they didn't sleep, they waited, sitting in the hallway with the attic door in sight, flashlight and old camcorder in hand, because Marcus said if anything happened again, they needed proof, and at exactly 3:17 a.m., the light bulb in the attic clicked on by itself, and from upstairs came the sound of something falling. Then the unmistakable scuff of children's feet running across the floorboards, and the camcorder in Marcus's hand flickered on its own, and began recording, and Holly stood up and said, "We follow it, now, we see," and together they climbed the stairs, opened the attic door fully, and saw that the seam in the wall had opened, revealing a narrow hallway behind it, lined with torn pages, childlike drawings, and mirrors that didn't reflect their faces correctly, and without speaking, they stepped inside, the air thick and humming, the ink on the floor guiding their steps like veins, and from somewhere deep inside the walls, a girl's voice whispered, "You're close, but not yet," and they kept moving, deeper into the hallway that had no right existing, passing through layers of silence and static, until they reached a door with no knob, just handprints pressed in black, and when Holly pressed hers over the print that matched her size, the door shuddered and swung inward, revealing a room that didn't belong to any house built by humans. It was round, impossibly vast, the floor covered in pages, floating gently in midair, the ceiling dripping not just ink now, but voices, soft and weeping, and across the room, a projection played on the far wall, home videos of the Crowley children playing in the yard, then suddenly crying, then screaming, and the video looped, skipping, like a broken tape, and below it stood a desk, and on it, another letter, this one newer, addressed to Holly, and when she opened it, her breath caught in her throat. Because it was written in her own handwriting, even though she had never written it, and it said, "You don't leave through the front. You leave through the end. One of you stays. The other forgets. Choose." And before she could speak, the lights above flickered and the attic door behind them slammed shut, and somewhere, in the corners of the dark, a child giggled, and a boy's voice said, "It's your turn now, and if you've been drawn in so far, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, because this story is inked into more than just pages. It remembers you too." The room pulsed with memory, not light, not warmth, but the kind of memory that isn't yours but still feels like it belongs inside you. Holly stood frozen, the letter trembling in her hands, while Marcus backed against the curved wall, eyes fixed on the looping projection that had now started skipping erratically, flashes of Lucas running, Maribel crying, their faces flickering like candle flames, and every so often, the screen would show something else entirely, a flash of an open eye, too wide, too dark, looking directly into the lens, and once, briefly, what looked like Holly herself, standing in the attic as it was now, only older, or younger, or wrong, and Marcus whispered, "They're trapped in a loop, not dead, not alive, but replaying," and Holly shook her head, but deep inside, she knew he was right. The ink wasn't just ink, it was a memory web, feeding, looping, preserving echoes of those who disappeared, and something about the house made sure it never stopped. The floating pages above them had started turning slowly, windless, and each one showed a fragment. A journal entry, a photo, a drawing, a sentence like, "He found the wrong door," or, "The attic shifts when you lie," and suddenly a loud creak came from above, but there was no ceiling, only dripping blackness that occasionally shimmered with faint outlines, like shadows of children leaning over, watching, then gone, and Holly reached for the desk again, this time finding a small, flat object hidden behind the letter, an old house key wrapped in fabric, stained with black ink and something redder, darker. She turned to Marcus, who was now kneeling on the floor, trying to read one of the inked pages that had settled beside him, and he said, "This one has my name," and showed it to her. It read, "Marcus, don't follow her, not this time," and before she could react, the room flickered, the lights dimmed, and a figure stepped through the wall, not from a door, not from any opening, but as if it had peeled itself out of the wallpaper, tall, stretched, vaguely human, but its face was featureless except for a constant drip of ink from where the eyes should be, and it didn't speak, only tilted its head toward them as if in invitation or warning, and when it took one step forward, every floating page dropped at once, the air grew thick, syrupy, and Holly grabbed Marcus's arm and pulled him toward the only visible exit, the way they came in, but it was gone, replaced by another mirror, and in that reflection, they weren't alone. Behind them stood the two Crowley children, faces pale, eyes wide with inky tears, Maribel mouthing something again and again, break the loop, and Lucas holding a small wooden toy airplane smeared with black. Then the mirror cracked loudly, splintering down the middle and swallowing their reflections, and the figure stepped back, merging into the wall like mist, disappearing, and then the lights returned, dim but stable, the projection now showing only static, and Marcus whispered, "We need to find the start, if we can't leave the end." And Holly suddenly remembered the calendar in the hallway downstairs, the one she thought was decorative, stuck eternally on October 3rd, 1996, the day the siblings vanished, and she ran, dragging Marcus behind her, the hallway now warped, curving in unnatural angles like the house had grown a spine of its own, doors appearing and vanishing as they passed, and when they burst out into the attic again, they found themselves not in the house they knew, but in a replica of it, slightly off, like a memory trying to imitate a place it never fully understood, and everything was covered in dust except one thing, the calendar, now showing today's date, but with two markings, one in red, return, and one in black, trade, and beside it, on a cracked wooden stool, lay a photograph, old and curling at the edges, showing Holly and Marcus as children, even though they'd never been here before now, and a note attached said, "One twin in, one twin out, one sister in, one sister out, balance maintained," and Holly staggered backward, realizing the house thought they were replacements, a second chance to finish the loop, or reset it, and from the basement below, a radio crackled to life, an old broadcast playing, "Missing, Lucas and Maribel Crowley, last seen October 3rd, 1996, if you have any information," and Holly felt the pressure building in her head, like memories that weren't hers were trying to seep in, overwrite her own. She turned to Marcus, but he was staring blankly at a wall, murmuring something, and when she looked closer, she saw ink crawling along his neck like veins, threading beneath his skin, slowly pulling him into whatever this house remembered him as, and she screamed his name, shaking him, and for a moment he blinked, said, "I saw Mom," and then collapsed. And Holly knew they didn't have much time. She dragged him out of the replica house attic, back through the halls that kept shifting, following the ink trails that now glowed faintly, leading her downward, back to the original attic, hoping the door hadn't vanished, and as she opened the last panel, something grabbed her ankle, cold and slick, and she turned to see a hand reaching from the wall, not angry, not violent, but desperate and attached to it. A face, a girl's, wide-eyed, pleading, and Holly recognized her from the photos, Maribel, still young, still alive in some warped way, and her voice whispered, "If one of you stays, I can go," and Holly kicked free, heart pounding, dragging Marcus through the last opening and slamming it shut, the house shrieking around them, the walls rattling like lungs trying to expel them, and finally they burst back into the real attic, or what they hoped was real, and collapsed on the floor, gasping. And behind them, the ceiling stain pulsed once. Then receded, shrinking slowly as if it had been fed, or fooled, and Marcus stirred, his eyes clear, the ink gone, for now, and Holly held him close, whispering, "We're not done yet," because deep in her chest, she knew the loop hadn't broken, only shifted, and they had taken something out with them, or left something behind, and if this story has you holding your breath, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Because the house isn't the only thing listening, and ink doesn't dry where memory still lives. The sun rose over the house as if nothing had changed, birds chirped, the wind moved through trees like it always had, but inside, Holly and Marcus sat in silence, backs pressed against the now quiet attic wall, staring at the space where the ink stain used to be. They hadn't spoken since collapsing there, the house hadn't made a sound, and for the first time in hours, or maybe days, it felt like time was real again. Marcus held the photograph with their childhood faces, flipping it over again and again, while Holly stared at the floorboards, her mind spinning through possibilities. What they had seen couldn't be explained, at least not in a way that made sense outside these walls. They had touched memories, watched events from decades ago, heard voices of the missing, and somehow walked out alive, but something didn't feel complete, something was still pulling, and when Holly finally spoke, it was quiet, like breaking a long-held breath. "I think the letters are still here," she said, "the ones we read about, the ones they left behind," and Marcus looked up slowly, then nodded, and they moved together, searching the attic's edges, peeling back boards, lifting dust-caked rugs, listening for the hollow sound of something hidden, and it was near the southern beam, beneath a crooked panel, where Holly pried back rotting wood and found a shallow compartment. Inside were 3 tightly folded papers, sealed with wax. The wax cracked with age and pressure, and beside them, a ribbon, stained with time. Each letter was addressed in looping handwriting, one to mother, one to the next family, and one marked simply with a circle and a date, October 3rd, 1996. Holly picked up the last one first, carefully unfolding it, and read it aloud. "If you're reading this, it means we're still here, we didn't escape. We tried, but the house wouldn't let us, not all the way. There's something wrong with the attic, it remembers too much. We don't know what happened to the first ones, but we heard them sometimes, crying, whispering. They said we were replacements, that the house chooses." The rest was smudged, as if tears had washed the ink away, or maybe the ink had leaked from the ceiling onto the page, and Marcus's voice was shaking when he said, "That's what you saw, isn't it, in the mirror, the other you?" And Holly nodded, her eyes scanning the other letters, opening the one to mother, which was full of regret and apology, but also instruction, saying not to trust the walls, not to sleep in the attic, never to open the mirror after dark, and to always, always leave something behind if you wanted to leave. The words, "leave something behind," repeated twice, underlined in ink that looked fresher than it should have. Like it had been rewritten again and again. Marcus took the last letter, the one addressed to the next family, and held it with shaking hands. He didn't read it, just clutched it to his chest, and said, "We're not supposed to keep this," and Holly understood what he meant. The loop demanded balance, and if they had taken something out, information, memories, even the photograph, something had to be returned, so they left the letters where they found them, carefully placed back into the space beneath the floor, resealing the panel as best they could, and as they did, the wind outside shifted, just slightly, like a breath had been exhaled through the cracks in the wood. They stood and made their way downstairs. The air felt lighter, as if the house was watching but no longer pressing down, but just as Holly reached the bottom step, her foot hit something small, round. She bent down and picked it up, a button. Deep red, covered in dust, and etched with the name L. Crowley, and her hand trembled, because that name wasn't supposed to be here, not in this house, and yet she knew what it meant. Marcus came up beside her and looked, his face pale. "It's not over," he whispered, and the front door creaked open, not violently, but like an invitation. Outside the air was warm, the sky full of heavy clouds, and a low rumble of thunder echoed in the distance. As they stepped out, the wind picked up, scattering a few old leaves across the porch, and Holly turned back one last time, staring at the attic window, where for just a second, a shape moved behind the glass, small, childlike, watching, and then gone. They left the house, locking the door behind them, and returned to town, to the motel where their car was still parked, untouched. But Holly didn't feel relief. She felt unfinished, like a book with the last chapter torn out. And when she connected her phone to charge, dozens of missed messages appeared, from friends, from their aunt, asking where they were, what had happened. Some dated days ago, though they had only been gone for one night, and as she opened her email, a new message popped up instantly, no sender, no subject, just a single sentence. You've been chosen, and a file attached named attic_sequence.mp4. She didn't open it, not yet. Instead she looked at Marcus, who was staring at his phone too, pale, lips parted, and when she asked what was wrong, he said, I just got a text from Mom's old number, and held it up, showing a message that read, don't forget the mirror. And Holly dropped her phone, heart pounding, because their mother had died 3 years ago, and the number was long disconnected. They didn't sleep that night, kept the lights on, sat with their backs to the wall, and watched the motel ceiling nervously, half expecting ink to begin dripping, but nothing came, until just before dawn, when Holly finally dozed off, and dreamed of the house. Not as it was, but as it had been before the attic was built, a clean space, warm, lit by oil lamps, and a small child drawing on the wall with a piece of chalk, shapes, circles, doors, and when the child turned around, it was Maribel, smiling, and behind her, Lucas, holding a candle, mouthing the words, it's open again, and Holly woke with a jolt, the motel room completely dark despite the rising sun outside, and the faint smell of ink in the air. This story isn't over, not for them, and maybe not for you either, so if you're still with us, like, comment your theories, and don't forget to subscribe, because the house is listening, and it remembers everyone who visits, even through stories like this one. The morning brought a pale light that didn't feel like morning at all, as if the motel room existed in its own pocket of time, sealed off and waiting for something to catch up. Holly sat in the corner, knees to her chest, eyes fixed on the gap beneath the bathroom door where a thin line of shadow pulsed like breath. Marcus hadn't spoken since the message from their mother's number. He just stared at the ceiling, at a small brown spot above the bed that seemed to grow if you looked too long, and when Holly finally moved, it wasn't from clarity or courage, but because the silence had stretched too thin, so she stood and crossed the room, opening her laptop and double-clicking the video file named attic_sequence.mp4. The screen went black for a moment, then static flickered before settling on footage from inside the attic, grainy, color-drained. Time-stamped 1996 even though the resolution suggested something far newer, and there, in the corner, stood Lucas and Maribel, facing away from the camera, unmoving, while behind them, a third figure hovered, tall, faceless, made of something darker than the rest of the image, like shadow drawn in by hand, and then the film jumped, cutting to a date 2 weeks earlier, showing the same attic, only now filled with other children, familiar faces, blurry, impossible to match, but they shifted too fast, moved in reverse, then forward, then upside down. And Holly's breath caught as she recognized her own face among them, younger, dressed in clothes she never owned, standing by the mirror with a hand pressed to the glass. The camera shook violently, then went black, and a single line of white text appeared. You are already inside. She slammed the lid shut, heart pounding. Marcus was still staring upward, but now he whispered, it's under our skin, I can feel it, and when she pulled his sleeve up, faint lines of black had reappeared on his forearm. Not dripping like before but etched in place like tattoos drawn by memory itself, spiraling. Words and symbols that pulsed faintly with each heartbeat. They couldn't run from this, not anymore, so they drove back to the house, the road empty, the sky bruised with low clouds, as if nature itself had leaned in closer. They didn't speak the entire way, only held hands once as the car passed the twisted tree at the edge of the property, its bark now marked with what looked like names carved in reverse, and when they reached the front porch, the door was already open, not wide, just cracked. Like it had been waiting for their return. The air inside was colder, denser, as if the house had sunk deeper into itself, layers peeling back one by one, revealing not decay but design. They climbed the stairs again, slower this time, careful, every creak a heartbeat, and when they reached the attic, it was no longer an attic, not in the way they remembered. The walls were smooth now, pulsing faintly, curved inward like a dome, and the ceiling stain was gone, replaced by a circular hatch above them, dripping ink in rhythmic drops onto a stone basin below. Marcus stepped forward, entranced, and touched the edge of the basin, which shimmered, showing scenes not of the past, but of possible futures. Holly saw herself screaming in a hospital room, saw Marcus walking into traffic, saw a child with eyes too wide drawing circles on a school floor, and then the images melted away, replaced by a sentence, "Choose your memory," and the room shifted, revealing a staircase behind a folding wall, one that led downward, far deeper than the structure should allow. They descended slowly, each step soft, silent, and when they reached the bottom, they entered a room with walls lined in mirrors, each showing a version of themselves, some older, some younger, some wrong, and in the center, a table with two small objects, a cassette tape labeled "Mother's Voice," and a key carved entirely from ink, somehow solid, barely tangible, and etched along its side. Final passage. Holly picked up the tape with trembling fingers, and Marcus found a small recorder on the table's edge, dusty but functional. He pressed play, and their mother's voice filled the room, soft, trembling, saying, "If you're here, it means the attic called you too. I tried to stop it, but the house remembers everything. Even the people it never met. I left you pieces to follow, but the last one is mine. I left something in the mirror, something I shouldn't have." The tape clicked off, and Holly's eyes burned. Marcus stood frozen, holding the ink key like it weighed the world. Then the far wall dissolved into black mist, revealing one final door, small, round, pulsing, covered in handprints. They walked through together, into whatever waited on the other side, and as they passed, the door dissolved, leaving behind only the basin and the attic above, which now pulsed quietly, like a sleeping heartbeat. This isn't where it ends, this is where the attic breathes again. And if you're still watching, still reading, don't forget to like, comment what you think the ink really is, and subscribe, because stories like these never really end. They just wait for someone else to remember them. The door didn't lead them home, not in the traditional sense, not in the way returning is supposed to feel, because as Holly and Marcus stepped through it, they didn't land on a floor. They floated, suspended in something between ink and air, and all around them were fragments of rooms, of memories, of voices repeating words they hadn't said in years. A snow globe shattered in stillness, rotating in silence. The house wasn't a place anymore. It was a memory engine, built to trap time and stitch it into narrative, and now they were inside it, not just as visitors, but as participants. Holly reached for Marcus, but her hand passed through him like mist, like thought, and then she heard her own voice at age 10 whispering, "Don't go up there, it sees you." And she spun, and there was the attic door again, suspended, wide open, and pouring out a thick, slow-moving ink that drifted upward instead of down. Inside the ink were shapes, arms, eyes, silhouettes of children stuck in looped gestures, brushing hair, drawing symbols, pressing palms to glass that wasn't there. Marcus appeared beside her again, but older, 20 years older, streaks of gray in his hair, and she realized she was changing too, shifting through versions of herself as they moved forward. They weren't traveling through space, they were walking along the seam of all the years the attic had hoarded. And it was guiding them somewhere, not toward truth, but toward culmination. They reached a hallway that looked like the one from their old house, but too long, warped, and lined with doors, each marked with chalk dates, 1994, 1988, 2002. Holly touched one and was pulled through it. No resistance, no time to scream, and suddenly she was back in their childhood living room. But it wasn't right. The photos on the wall showed other people with her face, other siblings, her mother smiling but with ink for eyes. She stumbled backward and fell through the floor, landing next to Marcus again. He was shaking, muttering numbers, dates, phrases in reverse, and behind them something crawled across the wall, a figure of lines, of letters, its shape constantly rewriting itself. It whispered, "You never left, you just stopped noticing," and Holly screamed without sound, grasped Marcus's hand and pulled him through the next door, which opened to a hospital room, and in the bed lay their mother, much older, whispering to a nurse, "I remember the house eating time," and as the nurse turned around, it was Holly, wearing a name tag that said, "Visitor, Cycle 4, they ran again, through fire escapes, old school hallways, forests made of paper and photographs, and finally burst into a circular room made entirely of inked words, walls covered in diary entries, floor made of letters they never sent, and in the center, a pedestal with two objects, the original drawing from 1996, and a quill made from a bird that shouldn't exist. They understood then, they weren't supposed to escape the house, they were supposed to rewrite it, to give it a new ending. Marcus picked up the quill and Holly unrolled the drawing, now blank, and together they wrote, not with words, but with memories, sentences made of feeling, regret, and what if. The room responded instantly, warping, rewriting the attic in real time, erasing corridors that never existed and restoring windows long painted shut. Then the pedestal cracked, the ink exploded outward in slow-motion waves, and they were thrown into light. Not the light of day, but the first memory they ever had, Holly. Waking up to a rainy window, Marcus calling her name from down the hall, and their mother singing softly in the kitchen, they opened their eyes and found themselves back in the attic, the real one, the physical one, except it was empty now, clean, no ink, no hatch, just old wood and dust and light filtering through slats. The house let go, or maybe they let go of it. Downstairs, the walls were still, the whispering stopped, and on the kitchen table sat the ink key, cracked in half, beside an old photo they'd never seen before, a Polaroid of them as children, standing in the attic doorway, smiling. Behind them, barely visible, stood Lucas and Maribel, fading out of view. They took the photo, the broken key, and walked outside into the daylight that felt honest, uncurved, final. Holly turned back once, and the house looked smaller, tired, just a house again, and they didn't speak on the drive away, didn't need to, because they'd written their ending, not perfectly, but truthfully. And when they finally stopped for gas 3 towns away, Marcus smiled at her and said, "Do you hear it?" And she listened, and for the first time in 29 years, the attic didn't echo. If you've come this far, thank you for listening, thank you for remembering. Don't forget to subscribe to stay with us as we uncover more stories like this, where memory bleeds, where houses breathe, where the past is not gone. It's just waiting for someone brave enough to knock on the attic door again.